Welcome to the State Water Board training on the state wetland definition and procedures for discharges of dredged or fill material, also known as procedures. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce first our Chief Deputy Director, Jonathan Bishop, to say a few words today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us today in these difficult times. The training today is to go over the permitting requirements in the state wetlands definition and procedures for dredge and fill materials. Those procedures go into effect on May 28th, the end of this month. Because there are lots of different goals of the procedures and competing interests, we had to make compromises. You may not have liked exactly where those compromises ended up, but the procedures were adopted and have the same force as regulation, and they will be implemented as written. These procedures supersede any regional board basin plan procedures in the extent that there's any conflict. I've asked staff to refer to me any concerns that they hear of the procedures not being implemented as written. In case there is some discrepancies, I want to know about it. The training today is focused on the dredge and fill procedures. In conjunction with the training presentation, the State Board also developed a user's guide, the implementation guidance, which is available for both staff and potential applicants to use to help them prepare and review applications. The implementation guidance is just that, guidance. The implementation guidance doesn't supersede the procedures. If you see a conflict, the procedures take precedent. Staff are committed to updating these guidance as we learn new things, but you shouldn't expect the guidance to be changed between now and the implementation date. The guidance is here to assist you as applicants in understanding the procedures. I'm going to stay for as long as I can, but I can't stay for the whole 2 hours. So if there are questions that you want me to answer, you should email them in per the directions in the notice, and I will turn it back to staff to give you an overview of the procedures.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. For today, we will be presenting our public training presentation, and then we will be answering questions from the online viewers at the end of the training presentation, except for those questions that are for Jonathan specifically. So I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Beth Payne. I'm the Chief of the Wetlands Permitting and Planning Unit here at the Division of Water Quality. Also presenting today are...
Hi, this is Paul Han. I'm the Chief of the Watersheds and Wetlands section within the Division of Water Quality.
And I'm Serena Liu with the Office of Chief Counsel.
Okay, we'll move on now. This training is not intended to be an introductory course on permitting dredge or fill discharges under federal and state regulations. Rather, the goal of today's training is to provide some background on what the procedures are, why they were developed, and how they fit into the state's existing regulatory framework in permitting practices, and what changes you may see after they become effective on May 28th. In other words, this training will focus mainly on providing applicants an overview of what the procedures changed compared to previous practices under the California Code of Regulations, and will not go over all 401 program questions such as fees or billing. In conjunction with this training presentation, the State Water Board also developed a user guide, as Jonathan mentioned. It's called the Implementation Guidance. It is available for both staff and potential applicants to use to help them prepare and review permit applications. Overall, the structure of today's training will loosely follow material in the Implementation Guidance, which is available on the State Water Board's Dredge or Fill Procedures website. We will also include a discussion about regulatory changes at the federal level and how that may affect state permitting processes in general for dredge or fill activities. You can see on this slide here the specific topics we plan on discussing today. If you're interested in a specific topic and not the entire presentation, please note that we have We will be posting a version of this presentation on the website, and we will include timestamps for certain topics on our webpage under the video link for your reference. So I'm going to go over the implementation guidance briefly. As directed by our board, staff of the State Water Board developed implementation guidance with the help of stakeholders. We solicited input through 2 public meetings and an informal review and comment period to help inform the development of the guidance. The goal of the guidance is to provide applicants and water board staff some general guidance in preparing and reviewing application materials for a dredge or fill project. As noted on the cover page in the guidance, the document is non-regulatory. The guidance does not supersede the procedures and cannot set new requirements that are not already set forth in the procedures. And as mentioned before, if there's any conflict, the language in the procedures shall control. Guidance is also organized topically. The guidance consolidates information on requirements for a certain topic from the procedures in one section and references the specific language in the procedures for the user to be able to find it easily. The guidance also does not cover all possible topics related to implementation of the procedures or the 401 program. Rather, the topics covered reflect the most common requests from stakeholders as identified through the public process. The guidance also represents a collection of information from the procedures, the staff report, and responses to comments received on the 2017 draft of the procedures. It was also revised in response to public and stakeholder input during the development process. For topics that are not covered in the guidance, applicants and water board staff are encouraged to refer to the other documents I just listed. Each section of the guidance consists of a general overview, answers to frequently asked questions, and resources that applicants and staff may find useful in preparing or reviewing applications. Applicants that have project-specific questions are also encouraged to contact the appropriate water board staff at the state or regional water quality control boards for more information. Lastly, the State Water Board may continue to revise the guidance that was mentioned before.
Thanks, Beth. Let's dive into the procedures now. When you consider the procedures, it's easiest to think about it as comprising 2 basic parts. These are 2 related but distinct components of the procedure. The first part of the procedure, section 1 and 2, includes the technical wetland definition, the jurisdictional framework, and the wetlands delineation. In other words, is it a wetland? If it is a wetland, is it the kind of wetland that the water boards would regulate? And if it is the kind that the water boards would regulate, what's the extent of that wetland? The delineation process works in tandem with the definition, informing some components of the definition. This part of the procedures applies only to wetlands. Remember that because it'll be important later. Again, the first part applies only to wetlands. Now let's move on to the second basic part of the procedures. This includes Section 4 and Appendix A. This second part sets forth what information dischargers should submit to the water boards to obtain a 401 certification or waste discharge requirements, and how the water boards will process such submittals. Section 4A is about the application submittal. Section 4B is about water boards review. Section 4C is about general orders, basically stating that these procedures don't generally apply to general orders. And Section 4D describes activities in waters that are not subject to these procedures. We typically refer to these as procedural exclusions. Appendix A is also relevant to this part. Appendix A is the state supplemental dredge or fill guidelines, which is essentially a modified version of the Clean Water Act Section 404B1 guidelines. So let's talk about what a wetland is. Our procedures provide a technical definition that's based upon 3 factors: continuous or recurrent saturation of the substrate, saturation long enough to cause anaerobic conditions within the substrate, and vegetation that's either hydrophobic or absent. So how does this definition compare to the federal definition? Actually, they're the same in most cases. There are 2 differences that you should be aware of. First, the procedures definition recognizes as wetlands features that meet the other 2 factors, but have no vegetation. An example of this is a mudflat. Under the Corps' definition, a mudflat wouldn't necessarily be a wetland, but it would be considered a special aquatic site and regulated in a similar fashion. Second, the delineation methods, which I'll discuss in more detail in a minute, are identical except that the lack of vegetation should not exclude the wetland from being a water of the state. So now that we know what a wetland is, let's talk about whether it's a wetland that the water boards would regulate. You might have noticed that I'm referring to the definition as a technical definition. That's because the wetland definition was developed with the scientific aspects as the focus. From a scientific perspective, how can you tell whether a water has the characteristics of a wetland? Whether the water boards should and would regulate the wetland is a separate question. There will be waters that meet the technical definition of a wetland, but not be regulated by the water boards. For example, low-impact development often uses artificial wetlands to help prevent discharges of contaminated stormwater. In many cases, these wetlands would not be jurisdictional. In order to determine whether a feature that meets the technical definition of a wetland is jurisdictional, water board staff must apply the framework and see where any exceptions apply. It's useful to note that we developed this framework considering current regional board practices, but given regional variation, you're likely to see differences from what your regional board has done in the past. Next slide, thanks. Remember that the jurisdictional framework applies only to features that meet the technical wetland definition. The jurisdictional status of other waters continues to be determined on a case-by-case basis by the regional boards. But for wetlands, we identify wetlands as waters of the state when they're natural wetlands, when they're wetlands created by a modification of a water of the state, or when they're artificial wetlands that meet specific criteria, including wetlands that were created as compensatory mitigation for impact to another water, wetlands that are identified specifically in a water quality control plan, wetlands that result from historic human activity, or wetlands that are greater than 1 acre in size unless it was created for a specific purpose. So there are some wetlands some artificial wetlands that are excluded. Artificial wet features greater than or equal to 1 acre in size that are constructed and currently used and maintained primarily for one or more of a set of specified purposes are not waters of the state unless they satisfy one of the earlier criteria that I just discussed. As an example, these purposes include industrial or municipal wastewater treatment or disposal, certain types of stormwater treatment facilities, agricultural crop or irrigation, industrial processing, fields flooded for rice growing, and a number of other categories that I'll refer you to the procedure text for. To assist applicants, the implementation guidance includes a flow chart that you can use to help follow along the logic path of the jurisdictional framework. Note that this flow chart isn't a substitute for the procedures language, but I do find it helps you think through the framework in a systematic way. Also, the framework should again remind you that it needs to be worked through in a semi-sequential fashion. If you determine that any of the earlier listed factors are applicable to a feature, that feature is a water of the state, regardless of whether it might also meet one of the jurisdictional exclusions listed at the end. So, for example, if a feature is determined to be a modification of a water of the state, the wetland would itself be a water of the state, even if it were artificial. Note that on the flow chart, as in the jurisdictional framework, the first question you need to ask is, does the feature I'm looking at meet the technical definition of a wetland? If not, stop. You can't use this framework. In that case, you should fall back on whatever your current regional board's procedures are.
The definition of waters of the U.S. is different than waters of the state. Waters of the U.S. are defined in federal regulations and are subject to statutory and federal constitutional limitations. Waters of the state, on the other hand, are defined by the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act and are not subject to the same limitations. Water Code Section 13050 defines waters of the state to include any surface water or groundwater, including saline waters, within boundaries of the state. California Code of Regulations Section 3831 recognizes the relationship between waters of the state and waters of the U.S. and describes waters of the state as including all waters of the U.S. This explanation can be found in footnote 2 of the procedures. Practically speaking, this means that if you have an approved jurisdictional determination from the Corps, then the water is clearly both a water of the U.S. and a water of the state. This also means that if you've previously been permitted by the Corps, the water will remain jurisdictional with the water boards, for the water boards, even if there's an action on the federal level to curtail federal jurisdiction. A common situation is when the Corps permits a project using a preliminary jurisdictional determination. With a preliminary jurisdictional determination, it is assumed that all the delineated waters are jurisdictional waters of the U.S. This option is more popular because it's generally faster and easier. Generally, we expect that any water that has met the definition of waters of the U.S. presently or historically would fall within one of the state's jurisdictional categories, such as it's a natural wetland or it's a modified water. But if it was ever easier to determine that something was a water of the U.S., you should know that it's also within the water board's jurisdiction. Note that federal jurisdiction has some affirmative exclusions. That means their definition says certain kinds of waters are not waters of the U.S. The procedures do not say that if you are not a water of the U.S., then you are not a water of the state. In other words, the federal definition of waters of the U.S. can get you into state jurisdiction, but it cannot get you out.
Okay, so you've determined that you have a feature that meets the technical definition for a wetland, and you've determined that it's the type of wetland that the water boards would regulate. Now you need to figure out where the boundaries of those wetlands are, and this is where the delineation portions of the procedure come in. And to do that, you use the same delineation procedures that the Corps would use. They're incorporated by reference into our procedures. Remember in California that you need to consider not just the Corps' 1987 Wetland Delineation Manual, but also the Corps' regional supplements, and those are listed on this slide.
That concludes our overview of the first portion of the procedures that applies only to wetlands. Now we're going to focus on the second portion of the procedures, which establishes an application submittal and review requirements for discharges of dredged or fill material to any water of the state, including wetlands, but not only wetlands. So, as Beth explained at the beginning, this presentation does not cover all aspects of the dredge or fill program. But let's start with this section off with some basic comments, basic concept, particularly for viewers who have less familiarity with the dredge or fill program. The next couple of slides are a very high-level introduction. If you would like more information, sections 5.1 and section 5.2 of the staff report provide a more detailed overview of the Water Board's dredge or fill programs, including an explanation of legal authorities, the types of projects that are regulated, and relevant statistics. First of all, do you need a dredge or fill permit? To answer that, you need to refer to the definition of dredge or fill material in the procedures, which is in section 5. This definition is consistent with the Clean Water Act and how the Clean Water Act is implemented through federal regulations. But in layman's terms, the procedures apply when you're putting fill into a water or taking dredge material out of the water. In other words, they apply to in-water work. Common examples of covered projects are development projects that fill in a water, or dredging to maintain stream capacity or improve infiltration. To answer this question about whether you need a permit, you also need to determine whether the waters you are discharging into are waters of the state. For wetlands, you can refer to the portion of the presentation we just went through about jurisdiction. For non-wetlands, you should contact the applicable regional board. The Dredged Fill program is commonly referred to as the Section 401 certification program, which brings us to our second concept. What is a Section 401 certification? Under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, an activity requiring a federal license or permit must obtain a certification from the state that the activity will comply with the relevant portions of the Clean Water Act and appropriate requirements of state law. There are certifications for many different kinds of federal permits. Here we are mostly focusing on activities that require a Section 404 permit, and the Section 404 program is administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. If you are obtaining a permit for a different kind, if you're obtaining a certification for a different kind of permit, this presentation may not be applicable to you, and we'll get to that in a moment. Another term you'll hear frequently is waste discharge requirement. What is that? Under the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, the water boards regulate waste discharges that could affect water quality, including the discharge of dredged or filled material. In other words, a waste discharge requirement is the general term for orders that the water boards issue to authorize the discharge of waste. What then is the difference between a Section 401 certification and a waste discharge requirement? Do you need to get both kinds of permits? Applicants in California must comply with the Clean Water Act, where applicable, as well as Porter-Cologne. Section 401 certifications are a type of waste discharge requirement. In other words, the order is both a waste discharge requirement and a certification. It's both. Where a discharge is outside the scope of the Clean Water Act, it is only a waste discharge requirement. As shorthand, because that can be quite a mouthful, typically we refer to Section 401 certifications for projects that are subject to the Clean Water Act and waste discharge requirements for projects outside the Clean Water Act. So do you need to comply with the sections of the procedures that deal with application submittal and review? We're going to go into this in more detail, but at the outset, let's screen some things that this does not apply to. This portion of the presentation will not be useful for you if you can comply with a general order, general certifications, or general WDR. If you can qualify for one of those, you should follow the terms and conditions of the general order, certification, or WDR. Also, if you need a certification from the Division of Water Rights, this portion of the presentation is not for you. For a request for approval from the Divisions of Water Rights for activities associated with the appropriation of water, or for a FERC license, you should ask the Division of Water Rights what should be in your application submittal. This portion of the presentation also does not apply to suction dredge mining. For that, you will need to obtain a Section 402 NPDES permit. And finally, this does not apply to applications submitted prior to May 28, 2020, which is the effective date. If the procedures do not apply to your application because you submitted it prior to the effective date, applications will be processed using the application procedures in place prior to the effective date, including the relevant portions of the California Code of Regulations cited on this slide. The language of the procedures that explains this is on page 4 of Section 4. There is also additional information in the staff report and in the implementation guidance. A commonly asked question regarding this section is, does my application need to be determined complete before the effective date? No, the language refers to application submittal, not the application determined complete date. Next one. The state board adopted the procedures using its authority to adopt water quality control plans and policies, and therefore the procedures have the same force and effect as a regulation. As I just noted, there were already some regulations in effect for water quality certifications in the California Code of Regulations. What happens to those? These regulations remain in effect. The relevant regulations are posted on the State Water Board's program page, but to ensure that you have the most up-to-date and accurate information, it's always safest to use the official version of the regulations, which is maintained by the Office of Administrative Law and is linked to in our website. The relevant sections are located in Title 23, Division 3, Chapter 28. As set forth in the procedures on page 4, footnote 10, and page 5, footnote 11, sections 3855 about filing an application and 3856 about the contents of a complete application are extended to apply to WDRs that regulate the discharge of dredged or filled material. In addition to the California Code of Regulations, the regions have some water quality control plans, some of which may have provisions related to dredge or filled. Pursuant to Water Code Section 13170, a water quality control plan adopted by the State Board supersedes a water quality control plan adopted by the Regional Board to the extent any conflict exists for the same waters. What about federal changes? Before we dive into the procedures requirements, let's briefly talk about some potential and ongoing changes on the federal level. I'm going to focus on two big ones that are regulatory and are either final or anticipated to be finalized shortly. First, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. This is the federal rule that defines the scope of the Clean Water Act and defines waters of the U.S. This rule's status is likely to change by the time in the next couple of weeks, but as of today, I'm checking the date, May 7th, it is scheduled to go into effect on June 22nd, 2020. Does the change in federal definition mean that there will be a corresponding change to waters of the state? No. As discussed previously, Clean Water Act jurisdiction is subject to statutory and constitutional limitations and is separate and distinct from how waters of the state are defined. How will it affect the procedures? The federal rule does not change the content of the procedures, but it may affect administration of the program. If the rule goes into effect, more applications will come to the water boards instead of the Corps. For those applications, the water boards will not have the benefit of the Corps' input. There are also be procedural differences in how certifications and WDRs are processed. For example, certifications may be issued by the executive director or the executive officer of the applicable regional board. Waste discharge requirements, on the other hand, must be issued by the regional water board. These changes may result in changes to the dredge or fill program that are not related to the implementation of the procedures, but are instead a consequence of the changing definition of waters of the U.S. The second change that I will mention briefly is the anticipated finalization of the Section 401 regulations. In short, the proposed regulations would overhaul the Section 401 program to place limits on the scope of certifications. This regulation is not yet final. You can look at the draft regulations that were proposed to see what was in the original proposal. And the water boards will have to craft a response once the final language is finalized and implemented. The regulation would affect the water board's authority under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. Where necessary, the water boards may need to rely on their state authority to the extent possible to protect water quality.
Thank you, Serena. Now let's move on to the application process. Before we get to the list of items required with an application, what will staff be looking for overall in an application for a dredge or fill project? As described in Procedures Section 4B1, Water Board staff will review applications to evaluate the potential impacts on the aquatic environment and determine whether the proposed project complies with the procedures. The water boards have the discretion to approve a project only if the applicant has demonstrated that a sequence of actions has been taken to first avoid, then to minimize, and lastly compensate for adverse impacts that cannot be practically avoided or minimized. The potential impacts will not contribute to a net loss of the overall abundance, diversity, and condition of aquatic resources in a watershed. The discharge of dredged or fill material will not violate water quality standards and will be consistent with all applicable water quality control plans and policies for water quality control. And finally, the discharge of dredged or fill material will not cause or contribute to significant degradation of the water of the state. So what do you need to submit with your application? The procedures require the following items for all applications. They're listed on the screen here. The first is all items that are listed in the California Code of Regs, Title 23, Section 3856. The second is a delineation report. 3 are the project start and end dates. 4 are all applicable maps. 5 is a description of the impacted waters. And then 6 is an alternatives analysis unless an exemption applies. The procedures also include a list of items that are required for some applications depending on the project. The first is supplemental field data from the wet season to substantiate dry season delineations. The second is if compensatory mitigation is required, a draft compensatory mitigation plan will be required. The third is for in-water work or water diversions. Staff can require a proposed water quality monitoring plan. Number 4, if there are temporary impacts, a draft restoration plan is required. And 5, for all ecological restoration and enhancement projects, a draft assessment plan is required. If you are not sure if your project requires one of these listed items, please make sure to contact your applicable water board staff to discuss your application requirements. Now we're going to discuss the alternatives analysis requirement. As shown on this slide, the procedures define the alternatives analysis as a process of analyzing project alternatives, including the proposed project, to determine the alternative that is the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. This we commonly refer to as the LEDPA. More information on the procedure's alternatives analysis requirements are in Section 5 of the procedures, including the definition, and the procedures also include information on the submittal, review, and approval of the alternatives analysis. It is important to note that an alternatives analysis required under the procedures does not always necessitate the same level of effort that applicants may be used to seeing for large, complex projects that have been analyzed under the federal 404B1 guidelines. We'll talk more about level of effort in a bit, but first let's talk about exemptions to the alternatives analysis requirement, or when are you not required to do one. So there are some types of projects that are exempt from preparing an alternatives analysis. The first are projects that would otherwise qualify for a water board certified core general permit, except that they impact non-federal waters of the state and therefore cannot qualify for the water board general certification. In other words, this exemption applies only to projects that do not qualify for the general order due to federal jurisdiction limitations. Note that the entire project must meet the terms and conditions of the Water Board Certified Core General Permit, including any core district's regional terms and conditions. Also remember, as mentioned earlier, if a project impacts only federal waters and the project qualifies for a Water Board Certified Core General Permit, for example, certain nationwide permits or regional general permits related to emergencies, the applicant does not need to follow Section 4 of the procedures and should instead follow the terms and conditions set forth in the general order. The second type of project that qualifies for an exemption are uncertified nationwide permits, but they must not trigger a Section 2 sideboard. These sideboard are described in lines 175 to 183 of the procedures. So if this project triggers any of these sideboards, they do not qualify for this exemption. These sideboards include impacts related to size of the impact, impacts to rare, threatened, or endangered species habitat and waters of the state, impacts to wetlands or eelgrass beds, and impacts to outstanding national resource waters, such as Lake Tahoe, or areas of special biological significance, which are found in coastal areas. The third type of project is if it's conducted in accordance with an approved watershed plan. The other, number 4, is an ecological enhancement and restoration project. And the last is if the project has no permanent impacts. So these are the list of the types of projects that are exempt from the alternatives analysis requirement. So for those projects that are required by the Army Corps to prepare an alternatives analysis, the Water Board will defer to that alternatives analysis determination. However, there may be a few cases where the Water Board will not defer, and that includes the following, as is also outlined in the procedures. The first situation is the permitting authority was not provided an adequate opportunity to collaborate in the development of the analysis. Applicants are encouraged to engage the Water Boards and the Corps concurrently and early in the alternatives analysis process. Giving the Water Boards an opportunity to collaborate will help ensure that the project is determined by both the Corps and the Water Boards to be the LEDPA and avoid application approval delays. The second situation is that the alternatives analysis does not adequately address aquatic resource issues that were identified in writing by the executive officer or executive director to the Corps during the development of the analysis. This may occur if the permitting authority was provided an adequate opportunity to collaborate in the development of the analysis, and the permitting authority raised concerns in writing, but those concerns were not addressed during the development of the analysis. And then third situation is that the proposed project and all of the identified alternatives would not comply with water quality standards. In such cases, the Water Boards are unable to defer to the Corps' determination because the Water Boards are unable to approve a project if it would not comply with water quality standards. If the project is not revised to comply with the water quality standards, the application would be denied. Because all projects must comply with water quality standards, this exception to deference is consistent with historic and current practice of denying certifications where a project will not meet water quality standards. More information about deference to the Corps' determinations can also be found in the implementation guidance, pages 23 and 24. And finally, where there is no project-specific alternatives analysis required by the Corps, or where the Corps' alternatives analysis did not consider impacts to non-federal waters of the state, it is not feasible to defer to the Corps' alternatives analysis. In these cases, the applicant must prepare a project-specific alternatives analysis or a supplemental analysis to consider non-federal waters of the state, unless the project meets one of several exemptions. So level of effort. The procedures state that the level of effort for the alternatives analysis should be commensurate with the significance of the impacts that result from the discharge. So where an alternatives analysis is required by the Water Boards, the procedures provide applicants quantitative and qualitative guidance to determine the appropriate level of effort to include in the analysis. This tiered approach will allow a more in-depth analysis for projects with larger impacts and for less analysis for minimally impacting projects, including consideration of indirect impacts. You can also find a description of these tiers in the procedures in section 4A1H. Line 194 is where it starts. So tier 3 projects are those that may result in significant impacts or impacts to sensitive habitat types. Therefore, analysis of tier 3 projects shall include a comparison of on-site and off-site practicable alternatives. Tier 2 projects may result in moderate impacts or cannot inherently be in an alternate location. Therefore, analysis of Tier 2 projects need only include a comparison of practicable on-site alternatives because all off-site alternatives are not logistically feasible. Tier 2 projects also include that for routine operation and maintenance of existing facilities, analysis of on-site alternatives is limited to operation and maintenance alternatives for that facility. And then finally, Tier 1 projects are those smaller, minimally impacting projects. An evaluation of a Tier 1 project requires a description of those steps that have been or will be taken to avoid and minimize the loss of or significant adverse impacts to beneficial uses of water of the state. Note that impacts as used in the size criteria here include both permanent and temporary impacts. So if you are required to prepare an alternatives analysis for your project, what do the procedures require in that analysis? We don't have time to go into great detail on what an alternatives analysis would consist of here today, but at a high level, we can discuss that the procedures require you to demonstrate that the proposed project is the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, the LEDPA. The term practicable means that the alternative is available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and other logistics in light of the overall project purpose. We also recommend a systematic approach when preparing an alternatives analysis. The first step is to establish the project's overall purpose that will be used to evaluate the alternatives. Water Board staff must also consider the purpose and objectives of the project set forth by the applicant. Note that the overall project purpose should not be defined so narrowly so as to preclude the existence of practical alternatives. Next, you should list and briefly describe those alternatives that could meet the overall project purpose. This could include the proposed alternative, off-site alternatives for a Tier 3 project, and on-site alternatives for the Tier 2 project. All alternatives should be analyzed for practicability. This is a very brief overview of an alternatives analysis. And for more information on determining practicability, please also see Section 3E of the implementation guidance, which contains a lot more information.
Thanks, Beth. Now I want to talk about mitigation requirements. Requirements for compensatory mitigation can be found in 3 areas of the procedures. Section 4A2B outlines what an applicant needs to submit in a draft compensatory mitigation plan for a complete application if compensatory mitigation is required. Section 4B5 outlines the Water Board's review and approval requirements. Staff will need to ensure that the criteria listed in this section are met prior to approval of a compensatory mitigation plan. Compensatory mitigation plans also need to comply with the state's guidelines, Subpart J, that's in the appendix to the procedures. Subpart J includes more detailed information, including definitions related to compensatory mitigation and other considerations related to site selection, type, and method. Compensatory mitigation means the restoration, establishment, enhancement, and/or in certain circumstances, preservation of aquatic resources for the purposes of offsetting unavoidable adverse impacts which remain after all appropriate and practicable avoidance and minimization has been achieved. The procedures in Section 4A2B outline the items that are required in a draft compensatory mitigation plan if compensatory mitigation is required. The items required in such a plan are listed on this slide. For the first 3, the watershed profile, the conditions assessment, and the no net loss description, are required for all types of permitting mitigation, or all types of mitigation. The last ones, ecological performance standards, timeline, design criteria, notification of local entities, and climate change assessments, are applicable only to permittee responsible mitigation. So there's a number of terms that you need to be familiar with as you look through the mitigation requirements. And I'm going to walk through those here in the next few slides. First of all, we need to talk about a watershed approach. The procedures require mitigation to be located using a watershed approach. Now, a watershed approach is an analytical process for evaluating the environmental effects of a proposed project and making decisions that support the sustainability or improvement of aquatic resources within that watershed. The mitigation amounts, types, and locations will be informed by the watershed approach, and that watershed approach is going to be based on a watershed profile, which I'll explain in just a second. The watershed approach recognizes that the abundance, diversity, and condition of aquatic resources in a watershed affect the beneficial uses of the receiving waters, and that diversity of aquatic resources includes both the types of aquatic resources and the location of those aquatic resources within a watershed. Consideration is also given to understanding the historic and potentially aquatic resource conditions past and projected in the watershed and the terrestrial connections between the aquatic resources. The watershed approach can be used to evaluate avoidance and minimization of direct, indirect, and cumulative project impacts. It can also be used in determining compensatory mitigation requirements. Compensatory mitigation amounts, type, and location will be informed by the applicant's use of the watershed approach based on a watershed profile. So now let's talk about a watershed profile. That is a compilation of data or information on the abundance, diversity, and condition of aquatic resources in a project evaluation area. The watershed profile needs to include a map and a report characterizing the location, abundance, and diversity of aquatic resources in the project evaluation area, assessing the condition of aquatic resources in the project evaluation area, and describing the environmental stress factors affecting that condition. So the next thing you need to know is what a watershed, what an evaluation area is. A watershed profile needs to be considered based on the project's evaluation area, which is identified as an area that includes the project impact site and or the compensatory mitigation site and is sufficiently large to evaluate the effects of the project or the compensatory mitigation on the abundance, diversity, and conditions of aquatic resources in an ecologically meaningful unit of the watershed. This may be an entire watershed or it may be only a portion of a watershed. Applicants have the option of developing a watershed profile using information in watershed plans. Doing so may result in a reduction of the amount of compensatory mitigation that's required to offset impacts. Watershed plans need to be approved by the water boards and meet the definitions set forth in the procedures. This can be done on a project-by-project basis or on a region-wide basis. So some examples of watershed plans are watershed plans that you might have developed for, say, for example, a 319H non-point source grant. Some habitat conservation plans or natural community conservation plans. It needs to, again, you need to make sure that you have approval from your water boards to use that to ensure that the plans meet the definition of watershed plan as identified within the procedures. Next slide. The procedures establish a minimum of 1-to-1 compensatory mitigation ratio when compensatory mitigation is required. This is different from the Corps' requirements, as federal guidelines may allow for less than 1-to-1 in certain circumstances. And it's important to know that this minimum ratio applies only to wetlands and streams and is measured in area or length. Also, the procedures encourage applicants and staff to engage in interagency coordination. This is so it's possible to achieve concurrent mitigation requirements so that there's less of an opportunity of conflict between agencies, as well as to achieve multiple environmental benefits. Finally, the procedures adopt a compensatory mitigation type hierarchy that states in general the water boards will first consider compensatory mitigation proposals from banks, and then in lieu fees, and then permittee responsible mitigation. It's important to note that this is just a soft preference and it's ultimately based on what's environmentally preferable. In some instances, permittee responsible mitigation may be the preferred option. The procedures also state that the water boards may require a climate change assessment for certain permittee responsible compensatory mitigation projects. Guidance on conducting a climate change assessment is included as attachment A to the implementation guidance document that Beth talked about at the beginning of the presentation. This framework includes site-specific and landscape scale factors that should be considered when preparing a climate change assessment, and also includes some resources that'll help inform project planning to help avoid and minimize those impacts.
Thank you, Paul. Now let's move on to when your project may be exempt from complying with these procedures. There are some areas and activities that are excluded from the application submittal, review, and approval requirements set forth in the procedures. This does not mean that they're excluded from jurisdiction. They may still be waters of the state and may be subject to other regulations. These exclusions do not affect the Water Board's authority to issue or waive waste discharge requirements. And note that there is one exclusion, the one that you see on the screen, that is applicable to public agencies, water utilities, or special districts for routine and emergency operation and maintenance activities that specifically states that the applicant may still need to get a certification or a waste discharge requirement. And these projects may need to comply with the application requirements outlined in the California Code of Regulations, Title 23, Section 3856. As shown on the slide, these excluded areas and activities include the following: wetlands used for rice cultivation, prior converted cropland, Clean Water Act Section 404F, activities such as normal farming, ranching, and silviculture activities, certain features used for agricultural purposes, the routine and emergency operation and maintenance activities conducted by public agencies, water utilities, or special districts, routine operation and maintenance activities for other artificial features, and suction dredge mining. More information about these specific exclusions can be found in Section 4D of the procedures and Section 5 of the implementation guidance. So that completes this training presentation today. For more information, please refer to the following resources that are available on the Dredge or Fill webpage on the State Water Board's website. Resources and references that you will find helpful are the procedures themselves, the staff report, and the implementation guidance, which also includes many other resources and references to useful information. Also, any other information that becomes available will also be posted to the website, and this may include some regional specific guidance. So thank you, everyone. We will start answering some online questions that we've received. Also, again, this is our website where you can find more information and a recording of training presentation there later on once we've got it ready to go. You can also always call us at the State Water Board at the phone number listed. It is 916-341-5900.